Does the government work for us, or do we work for the government? Are there any serious economic thinkers who believe that the passage of the debt increase will lead us to prosperity? Tonight, why the government apologists were wrong and the Austrian economists were right. At the turn of the century, the progressive movement, led by the Republican Theodore Roosevelt and the Democrat Woodrow Wilson, brought sweeping changes to the domestic and foreign policy of the United States. Heavily influenced by socialist and Marxist thought, and fearful that the free market might become more powerful than the federal government, the progressives initiated radical changes in our financial system. Up until the early 1900s, the American system of trade and capital was based on the work of economists who argued that the government should get out of the way. This was essentially a free market, unregulated by the government, without a central bank, without a personal income tax, and with all dollars backed by gold. It was the most prosperous time in our history, and one in which a higher percentage of the poor became middle class, and middle class became rich than in any other time in our history. But this was too much freedom for Roosevelt and Wilson. It was too many people doing too many things that the government was not controlling. So those two nanny-staters struck. During the wars and upheavals of the early 20th century, progressives in the government led by those two were at a loss to pay for their new domestic welfare and international warfare programs. They knew that the only way to increase their power would be to separate the dollar from gold and to control all the banks. The government planners needed a good crisis, and with World War I, they got it. That was the time for the socialist economists to fight, and the mainstream economists who believed the government should stay out of the way were forced to take a back seat in light of the war, in light of the hysteria, and in light of the nationalistic fervor that gripped the world. During the interwar period, a fierce debate erupted between the free market economists, who were called Austrians, and the socialists in the government. The Austrians, who were not necessarily from Austria, argued that socialists could never figure out how the government could manage an economy. Austrian economists such as Friedrich von Hayek and Ludwig von Mises revealed the absurdity of having central planners in Washington decide what the price of wheat should be, rather than letting the free market decide it. In the years leading up to 1929 and the great stock crash, the Austrians stood alone, arguing against the socialists who had taken over the United States monetary system. But the federal government put the Austrians aside, and the wealth of the United States was turned over to the central bankers, who declared just days before the 1929 crash that the economy was good. It had reached a plateau. Sound familiar? Today, the federal government spends about $3.7 trillion a year, but it only collects about $2.2 trillion a year in taxes. The tax revenues are not likely to go up, but after the debt ceiling increase, the spending will go up. So what will the mainstream government economists recommend for the U.S. when unemployment and inflation either stay the same or get worse? They'll recommend that we do exactly what we're doing now, borrow against the future and spend it all today. What will the Austrian economists recommend? They'll recommend what has worked throughout history. Cut spending, lower taxes, save money, and restore a sound monetary system based on gold. Since the debt deal has passed, the stock market has sunk like a rock in a pond. 500 points today alone. The president blames that on greed. The Democrats blame that on taxes that are too low. The Republicans have gone home. You know the reason the market is sinking and unemployment is rising. It is the futility of doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting a different result. Only economic ideas that combine money with morality can bring prosperity. It is not the government's idea of theft by taxation and confiscation by printing money and taxing by inflation. It is a system based on hard work, savings, investment, and free choices that will bring us prosperity. It is the Austrian School of economics. If the government accepts it, we can become prosperous again. But as long as the government rejects it, these crises will continue to come without warning. But don't expect the government to come to its senses overnight. You see, more freedom means less government. How much time will pass before we see that? From New York, defending freedom,